The maid's little girl gave away her last epinephrine injector to save a dying mafia boss, and he broke down and cried. The most powerful man in New York had never imagined his life would be saved by a 4-year-old child. As he lay dying alone on the floor of his private study, no bodyguard, no doctor had reached him in time. The only person who walked into that room was the maid's tiny daughter. She recognized the signs in seconds, the same ones she'd lived through herself many times before. Quietly, she unzipped her bunny-shaped backpack, pulled out her last EpiPen, and injected the dying stranger. She knew that if she gave away that dose, the next time her own deadly allergy flared up, she might not have a chance to survive, but she didn't hesitate for a single second, and that one innocent decision changed the fate of an entire mafia empire. Before we dive into this deeply moving story, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're listening from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin. The Moretti estate stood at the end of a long private road on the north shore of Long Island, hidden behind stone walls nearly a century old. Iron gates rose in black, heavy pillars at the entrance, where men in dark suits stood guard with earpieces they never removed and eyes that never rested. Old oaks loomed over the driveway like silent witnesses, and beyond them stretched hedges trimmed so perfectly they looked drawn with a ruler. Cameras watched every corner of the grounds, their small red lights blinking in a rhythm that hadn't faltered in 3 years. From the outside, the estate looked like a photograph from an old magazine: marble columns, a circular driveway gleaming after the morning rain, black cars parked by the fountain like patient animals waiting for a command. A gardener clipped hedges somewhere along the western wall, the sound of his shears soft and patient in the cold autumn air. But no one standing outside those walls could feel what lived within. No one could sense the emptiness that filled the long corridors after dark. No one could feel how quiet a 30-room house becomes when the man who owns it has forgotten how to speak above a whisper. Alessandro Moretti walked the second-floor corridor alone, 38 years old, the most powerful mafia boss in New York, yet his steps on the cold marble made no more sound than a ghost passing through a museum. He wore black as always now, a dark suit hugging his frame, a black shirt buttoned to the throat. Silver threads had begun to appear at his temples, though he was still too young for them. His face carried the sharp features of a man who had once known how to smile and had somehow forgotten over 3 long years. He passed paintings without turning his head, past 2 closed doors, the ones that had once belonged to Isabella and little Chiara, without slowing his stride. Behind those doors, the rooms remained exactly as they'd been left 3 years ago. A silver hairbrush on the vanity with a single dark strand caught in its bristles, a small pink dress folded on a chair, a teddy bear lying on a bed where no one had slept since that rainy night in Manhattan when a car bomb turned everything he loved to ash and silence. Alessandro never opened those doors. He passed them every morning and every evening. He never stopped. 3 years ago, on a wet street outside a small Italian restaurant, a bomb meant for him had taken his wife Isabella and his 4-year-old daughter Chiara. That night, Alessandro stood at the edge of the rubble with ash in his mouth, and something inside his chest went still. Since then, he ruled his empire with a look rather than a voice. He ate alone at a table set for one. He slept perhaps 4 hours a night. He trusted almost no one and loved no one at all. Power could buy every room in the world, but it could not fill the space where love had once lived. On the other side of the water in Brooklyn, on a small street of brownstone houses, another silence was beginning its morning. Autumn light fell pale and cold through the kitchen window, illuminating a chipped mug, a folded towel and a small photograph taped to the refrigerator door, a young man in a hard hat, his arm around a woman in green. Sophia Carter opened her eyes exactly 5 minutes before 6, as she had done every morning for the past 2 years. 28 years old, dark hair pulled back, a quiet, tired beauty that only revealed itself to those who looked twice. 6 months ago, Sophia had started working as a new maid at the Moretti estate, the only one of 5 who hadn't quit. The others left because the master of the house never spoke, and the corridors were too cold. Sophia stayed because she couldn't afford to leave. She rose carefully, trying not to wake the small, warm body beside her. Emma, 4 years old, curled against her mother's side under a thin blue blanket, a tiny fist pressed to her cheek. Emma had her father's dark lashes and her mother's serious expression, but her eyes were entirely her own, large, quiet, somehow older than they should have been. Emma almost never cried. Emma almost never asked why. In her short life, Emma had already learned that the world was a place where some questions had no answers for her mother. There was a reason Emma's eyes had become so serious. From 18 months old, she'd lived with a severe anaphylactic allergy, a rare protein that could close her throat in less than 3 minutes. She'd already survived 4 attacks. Each one left its mark on how she looked at the world. In the small pink bunny-shaped backpack she carried everywhere, there was always one thing more precious than any toy: an EpiPen. 2 years ago, Sophia's husband David had died on a construction site in Queens. Scaffolding collapsed beneath him on a Tuesday morning. Since then, she'd raised Emma alone. The medication cost nearly as much as she earned in a month. At 6:47 a.m. the phone on the nightstand vibrated. Sophia read the message twice before it sank in. The nanny's own child had a fever overnight. The nanny wouldn't come, she was sorry. Sophia stood in the middle of the kitchen with her hand pressed to her mouth. If she missed her shift, she'd lose the entire month's pay. And that month's pay was the only thing keeping Emma's medication on the shelf. She knelt before her daughter, who had wandered out in mismatched socks. "Sweetheart, Mommy needs to take you with me today, but you have to promise to be very, very quiet." Emma nodded once. She didn't ask why. Sophia carefully placed the last spare EpiPen into the pink bunny backpack, and together they stepped out into the cold morning toward the subway. The service gate on the east side of the estate opened for exactly 90 seconds each morning during the guard shift change. Sophia had learned that pattern in her first month. Today she used it to bring a 4-year-old onto the grounds. Emma held her mother's hand tightly. She didn't look at the high walls or the cameras above the gates. She just matched her steps to her mother's rhythm, clutching the pink bunny backpack to her chest like something fragile. Sophia led her down a narrow stone staircase into the basement corridor. Halfway along, there was a small room the staff used for coats and meals, low ceiling, worn armchair, a lamp casting warm yellow light. It was the quietest room in the estate, and the least likely for anyone to enter before evening. Sophia knelt before Emma. "Sweetheart, stay here. No matter what you hear upstairs, don't leave this room. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, hugging the bunny backpack to her belly. She climbed into the armchair, so deep that her little feet didn't reach the edge. In that moment she looked impossibly small. Sophia kissed the top of her head and climbed the back stairs to start her shift. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a frightened bird. She couldn't know that around noon, Alessandro Moretti himself would pass that door. He was heading down to inspect a case of wine just arrived from Piedmont, something he rarely did personally. But this batch contained a bottle his father had once loved. Alessandro walked slowly when a strip of yellow lamplight fell across the marble floor from a slightly open door. He stopped. Through the gap he saw a small child sitting alone in a chair far too big for her, arms wrapped around a soft pink bunny backpack, legs swinging in the air. Something inside his chest tightened like a fist. Chiara, if she had survived, would be about that size now. She'd be sitting in just such a chair with swinging legs. Alessandro didn't enter. He stood in the corridor for 5 seconds, then quietly turned and walked away. A few minutes later upstairs, he stopped a passing maid and told her to summon Sophia Carter. Sophia appeared with a cloth in her hands, pale. She began apologizing before he could speak. The nanny cancelled. She had nowhere to leave the child. She'd understand if she was fired. Alessandro let her finish. Then he said only, "Watch her carefully, don't let the child wander the house." He turned and walked back toward his study. Sophia stood in the corridor, pressing her hand to her chest, her eyes suddenly red with a gratitude she couldn't name. Passing the butler's post, Alessandro paused and gave a quiet order, "Bring lunch down to the staff room, something warm, something a child would eat." He offered no explanation, and no one dared ask. Midday, the estate settled into the quiet rhythm that always held between 3 and 5. Golden autumn light fell in low diagonal beams through tall arched windows, painting long warm rectangles on polished floors. The grandfather clock ticked with patient regularity. Somewhere, a copper pot was being scoured. This was the hour when the great house briefly pretended to be just a house. Vincenzo Bellini walked the corridor with the same unhurried steps he'd used for 20 years. 60 years old, silver hair carefully combed back, grey waistcoat over a starched white shirt. Soft eyes that made new staff trust him within their first week. He was the head of household staff, and he'd stood beside Alessandro since the old man's father was still alive. Vincenzo was respected the way a son respects the father he's learned to lean on. Everyone respected him. At exactly 4:30 each day, the same ritual unfolded. In the butler's pantry near the storeroom, a small silver tray was prepared, a porcelain teapot with Earl Grey, 1 crystal glass of Barolo red wine, a folded napkin, a small dish of dark chocolate. Then the tray was carried upstairs to the master's private study. That had been Alessandro's habit for 8 years. He almost never drank the wine, never touched the chocolate, but the tray had to be there at 4:30 every day. Sophia appeared in the butler's pantry at 4:25. Her uniform was pressed, her hands still cold from the basement. Vincenzo stood by the shelves, rearranging a bottle of Piedmontese red. He turned when she entered and smiled warmly. "Your turn today, go ahead and prepare the tray. I'll finish up here." Sophia nodded gratefully and began arranging the porcelain, the glass, the folded napkin. She didn't see the small figure crouched behind the tall wine cabinet in the far corner. Emma had grown tired of sitting in the basement. Emma wanted to find her mother. She'd crept up the back stairs, clutching her plush rabbit, and slipped into this quiet room seconds before Sophia entered. Now Emma froze, one small cheek pressed against the wood. Vincenzo looked up. "Ah, the master just called down. He wants a bottle of chilled mineral water on the tray as well. Could you fetch it from the kitchen?" Sophia nodded and left. For 40 seconds Vincenzo was alone with the tray. From behind the wine cabinet, Emma watched him reach into his grey waistcoat pocket. She saw him pull out something small, a tiny vial, blue glass no bigger than his thumb. She saw him lean over the crystal glass of red wine. She saw his shoulders move once. She didn't understand what she was watching. A few seconds later, Sophia returned with the mineral water. Vincenzo thanked her politely. She lifted the silver tray, carried it up the marble staircase, knocked once on the study door, set the tray on the desk, inclined her head and left. The upstairs corridor camera recorded only one person entering the study that day, Sophia. Behind the heavy oak door on the second floor, Alessandro Moretti sat alone at his desk. The silver tray had been placed without a sound, and Sophia had already gone. A low fire burned in the marble hearth, casting soft orange light across dark wooden shelves along the walls. Velvet curtains were half drawn against the late afternoon sun. Outside, wind stirred the tall cypresses, but inside there was only the quiet crackle of the fire and the soft rustle of pages. Before him lay a stack of financial reports on the family's shipping interests in the ports of New Jersey and Baltimore. Figures, tonnage, timelines, columns of names. He read them the way another man might read a morning paper. Without looking up, he reached for the crystal glass, raised it to his lips and took a small sip of Barolo. The wine was warm and familiar, the same wine his father had drunk before him. He set the glass down and turned a page. 90 seconds later, something began to itch deep in his throat. Alessandro swallowed. The itch didn't fade. He swallowed again, harder, and now there was a strange thickness where his voice usually lived. He frowned slightly and reached for the water, thinking maybe it was dust from the fire. 30 seconds later, his throat closed, immediately, as if someone had reached inside and squeezed a fist. Air stopped moving. He tried to inhale and heard a wheeze, the sound no person should ever hear in their own chest. His lips began to go cold, his fingers to tingle. Alessandro stood abruptly, the chair scraping back. His hand reached for the phone on the corner of the desk. He knocked the crystal glass as he moved. It tipped and fell to the carpet, red wine spreading across the light fibers in a slow stain that looked, for one strange second, like blood. He tried to shout. Only a dry, rasping sound came out. 20 years living in danger, he'd prepared for a dozen kinds of death. A knife between the ribs in a corridor, a bullet through a windshield, a bomb under a restaurant table. He'd never prepared to die quietly in his own chair. He reached for the phone again. His fingers closed around it, but they were shaking, and the phone slipped and fell to the carpet beside the overturned glass. Alessandro tried to stand. His knees buckled. He fell sideways against the desk, his elbow striking the small bottle of water, which shattered with a sharp crack, scattering glass across the closed room. The camera in the study had been disabled years ago at his own request. He hadn't wanted anyone watching who came and went from that room. Now that same silence stared at him from every corner of his own house. No one heard the sound. No one came. Death doesn't always arrive with a roar. Sometimes it comes in the silence of a closed room, in the stillness between two turned pages, in a space no camera was allowed to see. In the staff room in the basement, Emma had been sitting still for a long time. The lamp above her hummed quietly. The armchair was so deep her little feet didn't reach the floor. Her bunny backpack lay beside her on the cushion and her plush rabbit was pressed to her chest. She was thirsty. The small juice box her mother had left was empty. Her tongue felt dry and heavy in her mouth. From above, through the metal vent grate in the ceiling, a sound drifted down to her, glass. Something heavy, something falling. Emma straightened. She knew that sound. She'd heard it once before at home in the kitchen when her mother had dropped a mug. But this sound was much bigger, and the silence that followed was the wrong kind of silence. Emma slid off the chair. Her wool socks made no sound on the cold basement floor. She stepped into the corridor. She remembered her mother's rule, don't go upstairs. But her mother had also told her, If something bad happens and no adult is nearby, Emma should be brave and find someone. Emma decided this was that moment. She climbed the back stairs. Her small hand slid along the wooden railing. Her small chest rose and fell. She didn't stop. The second-floor corridor was empty. Tall arched windows glowed gold in the last rays of afternoon sun. At the far end, one heavy door stood ajar, a narrow strip of firelight falling across the marble. Emma pushed the door with her palm. On the carpet inside lay a tall man in a black suit on his side. His face was grey. His lips were the colour of a bruise. His chest rose and fell in the wrong rhythm, small, shallow, wrong. Emma didn't scream. Emma didn't run away. She had seen this face 4 times in her own bathroom mirror in her short life. She knew what it meant. She knew the word anaphylaxis. Emma turned and ran back down the back stairs faster than she'd ever run. She grabbed her pink bunny backpack and ran back up. She dropped to her knees beside him and unzipped the bag. Her small fingers pulled out the EpiPen, the last one in the house, the one her mother had whispered over that morning. Emma paused for a moment. Her mother had said, "This is only for if Emma can't breathe herself." This was the last one, but the man on the floor couldn't breathe either. She'd rehearsed this dozens of times on a pillow under her mother's watch. Remove the blue cap. Press the orange end against the thigh. Hold for 3 seconds. Count out loud. 1, 2, 3. The needle pierced through the dark wool of his trousers. She held it steady. She didn't look away. She pulled out the needle and sat back on her heels, clutching her plush rabbit to her chest, waiting. 20 seconds passed. His lips began to change. The bluish colour receded. His chest rose in one long, rasping, deeper breath. Only then did Emma stand. She ran into the corridor, stopped at the top of the main staircase and called out in a voice far too small for the size of that house. "Someone is dying, someone is dying." Footsteps rose from below, 1 guard, then 2, then 4. Emma pointed to the study door and retreated to the wall, pressing her plush rabbit to her lips. Sometimes courage doesn't wait until you grow up. It comes in the smallest hands and does what the strongest couldn't. The private medical suite at the Moretti estate occupied a full room on the 2nd floor of the East Wing, white and quiet, staffed around the clock by 2 physicians and a nurse who lived on the grounds. Alessandro had built it 8 years ago after his father's second heart attack. He'd never expected to be in that bed himself. He opened his eyes 3 hours after Emma's small hands had left his thigh. The ceiling above him was pale. Somewhere to his left, a monitor beeped softly. His throat felt scraped raw, and his mouth tasted faintly of metal. He tried to raise his hand and found it heavier than he remembered. Dr. Alvarez was at his bedside in seconds, 60 years old, silver-rimmed glasses, a soft voice trained by decades of delivering hard news to hard men. "Don't try to speak yet, sir. Your airways are still swollen." Alessandro looked at him and waited. "You were poisoned. A purified protein was introduced into the wine. Anaphylactic shock. If that EpiPen hadn't been administered within the first 4 minutes, you wouldn't be here. Someone saved your life, sir." Alessandro's voice came out cracked and quiet. "Who?" The doctor hesitated. "The child, sir, 4 years old, the daughter of your new maid, Sophia Carter." Alessandro didn't answer. He slowly turned his face to the ceiling and stared at nothing. He, who had given dozens of orders for death, survived 3 assassination attempts, buried his wife and daughter, and learned to walk through his own house feeling nothing, had been left alive by a child he'd glimpsed once through a half-open door. He closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them. "Bring her." Dr. Alvarez quietly objected. "Sir, you should rest, the medication is still." Alessandro only looked at him. The doctor fell silent and turned to the door. Minutes later, Emma was brought in, plush rabbit clutched to her chest, with Sophia following, pale, her hands crumpled in her apron, her eyes red from tears she hadn't been allowed to finish crying. Alessandro looked at Emma from his pillow for a long time without speaking. Finally, in a voice that scraped the air, he asked the only question that mattered. "You knew that was your last shot?" Emma nodded. "Then why did you give it to me?" Emma looked at her rabbit, then back up at him. Her voice was quiet but clear. "Because you were dying too. I know what that's like." Alessandro closed his eyes. Something inside his chest, frozen solid for 3 years, cracked along a single thin line, and through that crack, unfamiliar and painful, warmth seeped in. He opened his eyes and looked at Sophia. "You and your daughter will stay here until she has new EpiPens. I'll take care of everything." Sophia's mouth trembled. She couldn't speak, only nodded. Some debts cannot be paid in money. They can only be paid with the rest of a life. By the next morning, the swelling in Alessandro's throat had subsided enough for him to sit up. At the foot of his bed stood the man who headed his personal security, Bruno, who'd served the Moretti family for 12 years, broad-shouldered, close-cropped hair silver at the temples, a face that never softened with a smile. Alessandro trusted his judgment. "I want everything," Alessandro said, his voice still hoarse. "Every camera, every print, every locker. I want to know who put poison in that glass, and I want to know by evening." Bruno nodded and left without a word. The investigation moved through the estate like a quiet fire. 14 people, 10 hours, not a single floor left untouched. By the time the light outside turned golden, Bruno was back in the medical suite with a folder twice as thick as before. He laid it on the small table beside Alessandro's bed and began, point by point. Corridor camera, between the tray being set and the moment the maid screamed on the stairs, only one person had entered the study, Sophia Carter. No other figure crossed the frame. Wine analysis. The substance in the crystal glass was identified as a rare purified protein distilled from Japanese hornet venom, capable of triggering fatal anaphylaxis in seconds. It was only in the glass, not in the bottle or the teapot. Fingerprints. Only Sophia's prints were lifted from the glass surface. Staff locker. Behind a folded towel in Sophia Carter's locker, wrapped in gauze, a small glass vial was found. The liquid inside was colorless, its chemical composition matching the poison in the glass 100%. Bank account. 3 days before the poisoning, a wire transfer of $300,000 had been deposited into an account in Sophia Carter's name. The source traced through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Motive. Sophia's deceased husband David Carter had died 2 years ago on a construction site in Queens owned by a Moretti subsidiary. The investigation had closed it as a safety violation. Sophia had filed one civil suit. It was dismissed. Any woman with grief in her chest and a child at home would have reason to want Alessandro dead. 6 points, 3 of them would have been enough for a conviction in any court. Alessandro read the report line by line. His hands trembled slightly, but not from shock. Something was wrong. The trap was too neat. 20 years in the underworld had taught him that real killings are messy. They leave ragged edges. This one had the smooth surface of an oil painting, but evidence was evidence. Bruno said quietly, "Should we arrest her?" Alessandro didn't answer immediately. He was thinking of Emma, sitting on a small chair beside his bed, clutching her plush rabbit, saying, "I know what that's like." He closed his eyes for one breath, then opened them. Arrest her, but not in front of the child. That's not a scene her daughter should carry for the rest of her life. Bruno nodded once and turned to the door. Alessandro stared out the window at the honey-gold autumn light spread across the eastern lawn. Something inside his chest had just been saved, and something else had just begun to ache. Bruno didn't keep his promise, whether through misunderstanding or colder calculation. The guards who came for Sophia entered the small staff room at the very hour when Emma sat on the floor beside her mother, chewing a piece of buttered bread. 3 men in dark suits stepped through the door. They didn't need to speak. Sophia understood everything in the moment she saw the dull gleam of handcuffs in Bruno's hand. She rose slowly, carefully freed Emma's fingers from the edge of her uniform, knelt before her daughter and took her face in 2 soft palms. "Emma, Mommy has to go away for a little while. Be a good girl here, Mommy will be back." Emma looked at the handcuffs, looked at Bruno's face. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough. Her chest was already rising too fast. "Where are you going?" "Just to talk, just a little while. Be brave, sweetheart." Bruno raised the cuffs. Sophia extended her wrists. The metal closed with a short, precise click, a sound Emma would remember for the rest of her life. Something inside her broke. Then she lunged forward, wrapped both arms around her mother's knees and screamed in a voice far too big for her body. "My mommy didn't do it. My mommy didn't do it. Please don't take her. Please don't take my mommy." Sophia couldn't bend down, her wrists were cuffed. Tears fell onto Emma's hair. "Emma, look at me. Mommy is going for a little while. Mommy promises. Be brave, be my brave girl." Bruno gestured to a young guard to lift Emma. The girl thrashed, twisted, screamed. Her plush rabbit fell from her hand and hit the floor. Sophia was led into the corridor, and on her last step she turned to see her daughter one final time. At the far end of the marble corridor, 30 meters away, Alessandro stood in the shadow of an arched window. He'd seen everything. He'd given the order that this shouldn't happen in front of the child. Someone had miscalculated the timing, or miscalculated deliberately. He'd find out which, but not now. Sophia passed him between 2 guards. She stopped, looked him in the eyes. She didn't beg, she didn't plead. She simply spoke one sentence, her voice broken but very steady. "Mr. Moretti, I did not poison you, I swear on my daughter's life." Alessandro didn't answer, he couldn't. 6 pieces of evidence still stood in his head. each a stone in a wall that couldn't be torn down by one wish, but her oath cut deeper than all 6 together. Sophia was taken away. Emma collapsed into the arms of a young maid who'd come to hold her. She cried until she couldn't anymore. Her plush rabbit lay forgotten on the floor. Alessandro stepped forward, bent down, picked up the small worn rabbit and held it for a second. Then he held it out to Emma. She took it, buried her face in the maid's shoulder and didn't look at him. Some wounds need no weapons, a click of handcuffs and a mother's last look are enough. 3 days passed in a house that had forgotten how to make sound. Sophia was held in a private Moretti holding facility, a converted basement level beneath an ordinary office building on the west side of Manhattan. She was fed, had a bed, clean water, a small window looking out onto a light well. By the standards of that world, she was treated respectfully. But she was still a prisoner, and every hour she sat on the edge of the narrow cot in a plain grey shirt, hands folded on her knees, staring at the door as if her daughter might walk through it. Emma remained in the estate. She'd been moved to a small sitting room in the east wing, warmer and brighter than any place she'd ever slept. She no longer cried aloud. She only sat by the arched window, her bunny backpack on one side, her plush rabbit pressed to her chest, watching the leaves outside turn red on the trees. She refused 3 meals. On the 4th, the maid caring for her sat on the floor beside her and quietly said that Mommy would be very upset if she heard Emma wasn't eating. Emma took a spoonful of warm porridge, then another, then set the spoon down and didn't eat again that day. Alessandro passed her door every evening. He never entered. He stood in the corridor for a minute, watching the outline of her small back at the window, then walked on. He didn't sign the arrest papers. Bruno asked twice. Both times Alessandro only said, "Wait." On the second night alone in the secure room, he replayed the corridor camera footage again. He watched Sophia enter the study 100 times, her posture, her careful bow before leaving, nothing extra. He reread the staff statements. Vincenzo's was the shortest and the smoothest. The old butler confirmed that Sophia had carried the tray upstairs alone, that no one else had been in the butler's pantry, that nothing unusual had happened. The words were too smooth. Alessandro lingered on Vincenzo's page. Something in those sentences wouldn't let go, but Vincenzo had been beside him for 15 years. There was no reason to doubt him. On the 3rd night, Alessandro sat alone in his study, the very room where he'd nearly died. The fire burned low. He stared at the pale stain on the carpet where the wine had spilled. A quiet thought pushed its way through. If Sophia had truly wanted him dead, why leave so many traces? Why keep the vial in her own locker? Why let the money trace to her own account? 20 years of instinct answered in a quiet, clear voice, "She's innocent." But he had no proof, only a woman's oath and 4 pieces of evidence that refused to bend. Alessandro rose from the chair. A decision was made. Tomorrow he would meet Sophia himself and visit Emma. The child might remember. On the morning of the 4th day, after breakfast had been cleared from the small sitting room in the east wing, Alessandro entered alone. He carried a thin leather case. Inside were 2 new EpiPens, the latest generation, prescribed by Manhattan's best allergist. He set the case on the low round table between them. Emma sat in one of the armchairs, her bunny backpack on her lap, her plush rabbit pressed to her chest. She didn't stand, didn't smile. Her large grey-blue eyes only watched him with the tired vigilance of someone who'd learned that adults don't always mean what they say. Alessandro sat in the chair opposite. "These are yours," he said softly. "From today on you'll always have a spare, never again without medicine." Emma looked at the case. She didn't touch it. Her arms stayed wrapped around her rabbit. Then she asked in a voice smaller than the room deserved, "Are you going to take my mommy away?" Alessandro didn't answer at once. The case felt heavy on the table between them, an offering that couldn't buy what he needed. At last he said, "Honestly, I don't know yet. I'm trying to find the truth, but I need your help." Emma studied him carefully, then nodded. "What can I do?" Alessandro told her in the simplest words he could find that someone had put bad medicine in the wine glass on his tray. The person who did it had made it look like her mother had done it. He needed to know what she'd seen that day. Did she remember that day? Where was she? Did she see anything? Emma bit her lip, hugged her rabbit tighter, then began to speak slowly, the way children explain the world when they sense something important is happening. She'd left the basement because she was thirsty. She'd followed her mother into the room full of bottles. She'd hidden behind the tall cabinet because she knew she wasn't supposed to be there. Alessandro went still. "And then I saw Uncle Vincenzo, the old man with the white hair." Alessandro leaned forward. "He told Mommy you'd changed your mind and wanted water. Mommy left. Uncle Vincenzo was alone in the room, but he didn't know I was there." Alessandro leaned closer. Emma closed her eyes to remember better. Uncle Vincenzo pulled a little bottle from his pocket, a blue bottle. He dripped a few drops into one glass on the tray, then he put the bottle away. Then Mommy came back. Mommy didn't see. Alessandro was silent for a long moment. A blue bottle, a few drops. 40 seconds alone with the tray. Enough, he asked very quietly. Are you sure it was Uncle Vincenzo? Emma nodded. I saw his ring with the black stone, he always wears it. Alessandro knew that ring, Vincenzo's family ring, worn on his hand for 15 years. He rose and walked to the window, turning his back so Emma wouldn't see his face. His fists clenched at his sides, nails biting into his palms. Then he turned and sat again, looking at Emma with a steadiness he didn't feel. Thank you, Emma, you've saved me a second time. Emma looked up. So Mommy will come home soon. Very soon, I promise. Alessandro left. In the corridor he spoke quietly and coldly into his radio. Quietly, not a word to Vincenzo. Pull the camera footage from the butler's pantry from Monday. Every second. Bruno and a select team moved silently through the security sector that same day, no extra paperwork, no loud questions. By the time the sun began to sink behind the western hedges, 3 facts had surfaced. First, the camera in the butler's pantry had gone dark for exactly 40 seconds, from 4:37 to 4:37:40. The camera control panel was in the security room. Only 3 people had access, Bruno, Alessandro and Vincenzo. Second, it wasn't a technical fault. The camera had been manually switched off from Vincenzo's own terminal. The access log recorded the timestamp of his login to the second. Third, after the shutdown, the camera automatically rebooted after 40 seconds per standard protocol. Vincenzo didn't have administrator rights. He couldn't alter the access log. He didn't know his own login entry would be saved. Bruno brought the report to the study personally and closed the door. Alessandro read the pages line by line, 2 full minutes of silence. Then he looked up and asked quietly where Vincenzo was now. In the staff quarters preparing for evening service. Nothing unusual, nothing. 5 minutes ago he smiled at the chef. Alessandro stood. He walked to the sideboard and poured a measure of whiskey, didn't drink it, only looked at it. Vincenzo, the man who'd been beside him since he was 23 when his father was still alive, when Isabella still laughed in these corridors. Vincenzo had carried a small bundle wrapped in a blanket to this very study. He'd stood beside him in the rain at the funeral, holding his shoulder because Alessandro needed something to hold onto to keep from falling. The question wasn't why Vincenzo had done it. Alessandro knew Vincenzo. He didn't have the cunning or the money to plan such a thing, no offshore accounts, no network. The question was, who was he working for? Alessandro set the glass down, returned to his desk and picked up the phone. He made 2 calls, one after another, to Anza, an old bodyguard who'd pulled him from a burning car 16 years ago and never spoken of it, and to Rocco, young, the fastest and sharpest in the organization, who'd taken a bullet in the shoulder during an ambush in New Jersey and carried Alessandro out of that basement on his own 2 legs. Both arrived within 20 minutes. The door closed behind them. I need something done and no one can know, not Bruno. Not the other captains, only the 2 of you, both nodded. Watch Vincenzo around the clock, his phone, his calls, his messages, everyone who enters his room. I want to know who he's reporting to. Anza asked quietly, and Sofia, Alessandro stared out the window. Leave her in holding for 2 more days. If someone is watching us, they need to believe we still trust the evidence. Rocco nodded. Anza nodded. Both left. Alessandro remained alone in the study. The whiskey sat untouched. Outside, the golden afternoon light faded. 48 hours, Anza and Rocco moved through Vincenzo's life like shadows he never saw. They recorded 3 phone calls, all routine: wine supplier, grounds manager, a polite reply to a friend, nothing extra. On the second night at 11, Vincenzo slipped through the servants' gate, told the guard he was visiting his sick sister in Queens. Anza followed on foot, Rocco in a car. Vincenzo didn't go to Queens. He crossed the Manhattan Bridge, drove past warehouse districts to Red Hook in Brooklyn, and stopped at a brick building with boarded windows and a rusted sign. 2 knocks, the door opened. Anza photographed through a long lens from the roof of a neighboring building. Inside, around a wooden table, sat 4 men in dark suits. At the head, a young man, maybe 35, dark hair slicked back, a jawline so close to Alessandro's that a stranger would call them brothers. Luca Moretti. Alessandro's cousin, the only son of his late uncle Marco, who died of a heart attack 10 years ago. Rocco caught sound through a directional microphone from 30 meters. Luca's voice came through clearly. Why is that little girl still breathing? If she remembers anything, it's over. Alessandro isn't a stupid man. Vincenzo trembled. She's only 4, she doesn't remember, I checked. You don't check a child's memory, Vincenzo. You eliminate her, and soon. Anza recorded every word, photos, audio. By 3 a.m. both were back at the estate. At dawn, Alessandro listened to the recording 3 times. His face didn't change, but the knuckles of his hand resting on the armrest went white. Then he gave the order, "Take Vincenzo now before he reaches a phone." Vincenzo was taken in the basement, no violence. Alessandro didn't need it. The old butler was 60 and he'd been living inside his own fear for months. When the door closed, he already knew the truth had gotten out. Alessandro placed a speaker on the table, pressed play. Vincenzo heard his own voice from the Red Hook warehouse, small and trembling, and sank onto a chair. "Mr. Alessandro," tears came before the sentence finished. "They took my sister, took her boy. Luca said if I didn't do it, he'd kill my whole family in one night." Vincenzo told everything. Luca had come to him 6 months ago, threats, money, the vial of hornet venom placed in his hand, instructions. Sofia had been chosen because Luca had studied her. A widow, her husband killed on a Moretti site, a sick child, a thin bank account, the perfect patsy. The 300,000 had come through Luca's shell company. The vial in her locker had been planted by Vincenzo himself. The motive was almost insultingly simple. Luca wasn't working with any other family, no external conspiracy, it was inheritance. If Alessandro died of anaphylaxis triggered by a vengeful maid, Sofia would go to prison for life. No one would ever trace it to Luca. His son Nathan, 8 years old, would be the sole heir to the Moretti empire. Luca would rule as regent until the boy came of age. Alessandro listened to everything, then rose and walked to the door. Before opening it, he stopped and turned. "Today you saved my life by confessing, but you nearly killed me. You'll stay here until this is finished." Vincenzo nodded, his face wet with tears. Alessandro climbed to his study alone, sat in the leather chair before the cold fireplace and didn't move for a long time. Luca. He remembered Luca at 7, running after him through his grandfather's garden in summer, laughing so hard he fell into the roses. He remembered Luca at 15, standing in the rain at his own father's funeral, sobbing into Alessandro's shoulder because Alessandro was the only person in that crowd of black who was holding him. He remembered Luca at 22, knee-deep in debt to people who broke fingers for far less, and how Alessandro had paid every dollar in one day without asking a single question. He remembered Luca holding Chiara when she was 1, walking her slowly around the room, smiling at her with the softest look in the family. Luca was the only Moretti blood left in the world besides himself. After Isabella, after Chiara, after the explosion and the ash and 3 years of silence, Luca had been Alessandro's only family, and Luca had wanted him dead for a chair. Alessandro closed his eyes. He'd learned to live without Isabella, without Chiara. Grief was an old room he knew by touch even in the dark, but betrayal of blood was a different pain. It didn't scream, it didn't burn. It simply hollowed a person out from the inside, quietly, the way water wears away stone. He opened his eyes, picked up the phone. "Bruno, take Luca Moretti alive. If he resists, put him down, but don't kill him. I want to speak to him before he goes to trial. He has a penthouse on the Upper East Side, a house in the Hamptons, an office in the financial district. Split the teams. I want him in 3 hours." Bruno moved out, but there was something Alessandro didn't know. Luca had an ear inside the estate's own security, not Bruno, but a junior guard who'd been quietly receiving Luca's money for 6 months. The very same guard who'd entered the staff room with handcuffs at exactly the wrong hour. 15 minutes after Alessandro gave the order, word reached Luca. Luca didn't panic. He'd been preparing for this hour since the day he'd first walked into the butler's pantry to find Vincenzo. Within half an hour, his backup plan was in motion, a plan built long ago, folded and set aside, one he'd never truly hoped to use. If he was exposed, he'd need leverage. Not Alessandro himself. He was surrounded by too many armed men, too many walls. But there were 2 other people Alessandro had begun to care about for the first time in 3 years. Sofia and the child. If Luca held them, he could trade his life for mercy, or at least a ship out of the country and a name no one would ever find. Upstairs in the study, Alessandro stood at the window with the last evening light on his face, convinced the net was tightening around his enemy. He didn't know that in another part of the city, at that very moment, it was opening. At 8 that evening, Bruno's 3 teams checked their weapons in the courtyard, preparing to move simultaneously on the penthouse, the Hamptons house and the office. At that same hour, in 2 places across the city, Luca made his first move. At the holding facility beneath the Manhattan office building, 4 men in Moretti security uniforms entered through the front entrance. They weren't Bruno's men. The uniforms were fakes, tailored 6 weeks ago. They told the duty guard that Alessandro had ordered the prisoner transferred to the estate. The guard called to confirm on a number he'd always been given, and a calm voice confirmed the order with the right words, the right tone, the right code phrase. It was Luca's number. He'd been on that list for 2 months. Within 5 minutes, Sophia Carter was led out through the service entrance with someone's hand under her elbow. Within 6, she was in a black van. At the same time, one of the junior guards came to the East Wing sitting room. Mr. Moretti wants to see the child in his study. The maid hesitated. She'd been told the child wasn't to be moved, but the man wore an official badge and spoke the master's name. And in this house, no one challenged a badge. Emma was led down the corridor with her plush rabbit in her hand. She wasn't taken to the study. She was led down through the basement, out a side door into the garden, where a second van waited with its engine running. And in the basement where Vincenzo was being held, one of the 2 guards at the door that night was also Luca's man. He entered with a sheet of paper, a full confession printed and signed, placing all crimes on Vincenzo alone. He forced the old man to sign, then drove a syringe into his arm, a dose designed to look like suicide. Vincenzo slumped. The guard checked once, assumed he was gone, and left. Vincenzo was still alive, barely but alive. At 9, Bruno reached the penthouse. Empty. The second team reached the Hamptons house. Empty. The third reached the office. Empty. Luca had vanished from all 3 locations. At 9:15, a scream rose from the East Wing. Alessandro heard it in the study and was down the stairs before it faded. The door stood open. Emma's plush rabbit lay on the carpet. Emma was gone. At 9:20, Bruno called, his voice cracking for the first time in 12 years. Sophia had been taken from the holding facility by men no one could identify. She was gone. At 9:25, a guard in the basement found Vincenzo slumped over the table, his lips grey. The house physician reached him within 2 minutes and found a pulse, thin as a thread, but beating. Alessandro stood in the basement corridor holding Emma's plush rabbit in one hand. Blood ran from his palm into his fingers. His nails had cut through the skin. He didn't notice. He summoned all his captains to the study, and for the first time since the night the car had burned on that wet Manhattan street, every man in that room saw something in his eyes they'd never seen before. Find Luca, find the mother and child at any cost, not a word to anyone outside this house. This is family business. Some devils show their true face only when they know they've been seen, and once they do, they never step into the light alone. They always drag a hostage with them. In the black van, Emma and Sophia were pushed together onto the back seat. Sophia's wrists were bound behind her with a plastic zip tie. Emma wasn't bound at all. It hadn't occurred to them. A 4-year-old wasn't a threat. Sophia leaned down until her mouth was at her daughter's ear and whispered so softly it was barely breath. "Emma, do you remember the game Mommy taught you? The Hansel and Gretel game?" Emma nodded once against her shoulder. "Drop what you have, anything, just without a sound." On Emma's left wrist was a plastic daisy bracelet. 2 butterfly hair clips held her hair on the sides. Around her neck, a thin chain with a small moonstone, a gift her mother had saved 4 months to buy. In her coat pocket was a paperclip she'd picked up off the sitting room floor the day before. The van slowed at the first red light. Emma pushed the first butterfly clip through the narrow gap at the top of the window. At the second red, the daisy bracelet. At the third, the second clip. At the fourth, the paperclip. At the fifth, the moonstone chain, the one she loved most in the world, the one that would catch the light best on a dark street. Sophia watched her daughter work in perfect silence, and tears streamed down her face without a sound. A 4-year-old was holding herself together better than her own mother. At the estate, Alessandro was on the phone with a contact inside the NYPD he'd kept for 12 years. He wanted every traffic camera image from Manhattan to Brooklyn for the last hour and a half. Rocco sent 30 men onto the streets within half an hour. They combed every route out of Manhattan on foot. 45 minutes later, reports began to come in. A butterfly clip on Canal Street, a daisy bracelet on Bowery, a second clip on the Manhattan Bridge. Alessandro spread a map on the table and laid his finger on each point. They formed a straight line from Manhattan across the bridge into Brooklyn, south toward the water. He knew exactly what Luca was planning. A cargo ship. 2 bodies that would leave the country and never return, that would never be found in any river or on any empty lot. "Everyone we have," Alessandro said. Cars, weapons, and 2 ambulances behind. We're going to Red Hook. Bruno hesitated. Do we call the police? No, if police come, Luca will kill them first and turn us into criminals in the morning papers. This is family business. It ends as family business. They rolled through the iron gates in a column of dark cars just before 10. Alessandro sat in the front seat, still holding Emma's small plush rabbit. He hadn't let go of it since the basement. He hadn't prayed in 20 years. He'd stopped praying the night they buried Isabella and Chiara, because it had felt like no one was listening on the other end. But that night, in the darkness of a moving car with the city sliding past the window, Alessandro Moretti prayed silently without moving his lips, not for himself, for the little girl who'd once given him her last medicine, and for the woman he'd nearly sent to prison. Red Hook, the waterfront at 10:40, fog rolled off the water and curled around the old warehouses in slow grey clouds. The lamps along the pier burned dim yellow through it, each one a small blurred moon. At Pier 7, a black cargo ship sat with engines running. Alessandro split his people into 3 groups, the way his father had taught him to split a hand into a fist. Anza with 8 men took the long southern route to cut off the path between the warehouse and the gangplank. Rocco with 6 went to the roof of the neighbouring building. Alessandro and Bruno with 10 approached the front door. Inside the warehouse, a wide concrete room lit by a row of caged lamps, Luca stood by a wooden table with 4 of his men. Sophia was tied to a chair in the far corner, her hair fallen over her face. Emma was held in the opposite corner by a large man in gloves, his palm over her mouth. Luca glanced at his watch, 15 minutes until departure, enough to walk 2 people up the gangplank and close the door. In the third corner lay Vincenzo, his hands and feet loosely bound, dried blood at his temple from a blow in the van. Luca had brought him to silence him for good. He was still breathing. At 10:45, Anza took down 2 of Luca's men at the back door without a sound. Rocco took position above. At 10:47, Alessandro put his shoulder through the front door. The gunfire began before it finished opening. 2 of Luca's men dropped in the first seconds. A third went down behind a crate. Luca shouted, "Stop, stop, or I put a bullet in the girl." He aimed his pistol at Emma. The man holding her pressed a barrel to her temple. Alessandro stopped. Everyone behind him stopped. The air in the warehouse turned solid as glass. On the roof, Rocco had the man in his sights, but the angle was bad. The child was small and there was 1 chance in 3 the bullet would miss. Alessandro didn't take that chance. "Luca," he said, his voice hoarse but carrying the length of that concrete room. "Look at me, this is between you and me. Let the woman and child go, take me instead." Luca laughed once, a dry sound that held nothing. "You think I believe that? You'll kill me as soon as they're out." "I swear on the grave of Isabella and Chiara, I don't kill my own blood." Luca paused. For 1 second something crossed his face. He remembered Isabella laughing in a doorway with flour on her hands, remembered Chiara at 1 year old, how light she was, how she'd gripped his finger as he carried her. 1 second. Then the face closed and what had lived behind it was gone. "No, I don't believe you, I've come too far." Luca swung the pistol from Emma toward Alessandro. And then Vincenzo, forgotten in his corner with hands that had worked free across the concrete to a pistol that had fallen beside the nearest dead man, raised the weapon. "Luca." The old butler's voice was full of blood. Luca turned his head. Vincenzo pulled the trigger. The bullet hit Luca in the shoulder. It didn't kill, only spun him half a step sideways, and his own pistol answered before his consciousness caught the command. 2 shots, low and back, both into the old man on the floor. Vincenzo's chest took them. He collapsed flat on the concrete and didn't move. In that same instant, the man holding Emma glanced away for 1 breath. Emma sank her teeth into his glove, wrenched free and ran, her small legs carrying her across the open floor toward her mother. The man swung his barrel after her. From the roof, Rocco fired once. The man fell before the echo faded. Alessandro was already moving. Luca spun, blood ran down his sleeve. He raised his pistol with a hand that could no longer hold it steady, fired. Alessandro went right. The round scraped a long furrow along the side of his jacket into the darkness. Alessandro didn't shoot to kill. He put 1 round into Luca's right thigh. Luca dropped to the concrete with a sound that wasn't quite a word. The remaining 3 of Luca's men turned and ran for the gangplank the moment they saw their boss fall. Bruno and Anza went after them. 2 went down on the pier. The third was taken alive at the foot of the gangplank. Then the warehouse fell silent, nothing but the sound of heavy breathing. Alessandro kicked Luca's pistol across the floor and stood over him. Luca lay on his back, blood from his shoulder and his thigh, his eyes open and still defiant. "Well," Luca said through his teeth. "Do it, finish it." Alessandro looked down at his cousin. In 20 years he'd ended more lives than he'd counted. He didn't end this one. No, you're going to live, you're going to stand trial. You're going to sit in a cell for the rest of your days, and every morning you'll remember that you tried to kill me for a chair and lost to a 4-year-old girl. Luca closed his eyes. He didn't speak another word. Alessandro turned away. Bruno stepped forward with handcuffs. Sophia had already reached Emma. They'd collapsed together on the concrete, holding each other, trembling too hard to stand. Alessandro dropped to his knees beside them. Words that would fit that moment didn't exist. In the end he only said, "Forgive me, I'm so sorry." Sophia shook her head. She couldn't speak, only held her daughter tighter. Across the room Vincenzo was dying. Blood pooled dark at his chest. Alessandro crossed the floor, knelt and took the old man's hand in his. Vincenzo's eyes opened. "Mr. Alessandro, the doctors are coming, you're going to be fine. I was wrong, save the girl. You just saved the girl, Vincenzo, you just saved all of us." The old butler's eyes didn't close, his chest still rose barely. The ambulances arrived through the fog 4 minutes later. Alessandro ordered 2 to follow the column and wait on the perimeter. Vincenzo in the first, Luca in the second, with 2 guards beside him. Alessandro carried Emma to his own car. Sophia climbed in beside him. On the drive back across the bridge, the little girl fell asleep on his shoulder, her small fist clutching his jacket sleeve. Sophia held the plush rabbit on her lap and watched the lights pass. Some redemptions come too late to undo what's been done, but when they come, they're still strong enough to change the ending of the story. 10 minutes before midnight, halfway to Long Island, Emma began to cough, first a small dry sound, almost nothing, the kind children make in sleep. Sophia's hand was on her forehead before the second cough. Fever, red blotches rising on her neck in the darkness like something surfacing through water. No, 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 no. Sophia tore open the bunny backpack, the leather case Alessandro had put in her daughter's hands days ago, in the front pocket. 2 new EpiPens, the best in Manhattan. She opened it. The case was empty. Someone had taken them while Emma was being led through the corridors. Luca, most likely, by his own hand. A man who understood that a child without medicine wouldn't survive, and he didn't need living witnesses if the plan fell apart. Emma's breathing turned to a thin wheeze, her lips going blue. Anaphylaxis, dust from the old warehouse, some chemical in the concrete, something she'd breathed in during those hours no one could reconstruct. Alessandro shouted into the radio, "Divert, nearest hospital, straight through the lights." The car swung hard into a turn, the engine opened up. Alessandro took Emma into his arms and tilted her head back to give her airway every millimeter of space. "Emma, Emma, look at me, don't sleep." "Do you hear me?" Emma's eyes opened halfway, grey-blue gone dull and distant. Sophia wept. "Emma, look at Mommy, stay with Mommy, please stay." Alessandro held her small hand in his, the hand that had saved him, and that night he had nothing to give her in return but speed. "Emma, you know who I am. I'm the man you saved, now let me save you, hold on to me." The car flew through the night. Streetlights swept over the child's face in waves, gold, dark gold. At 4 minutes to 1 they stopped at St. Luke's Hospital. Alessandro had called ahead, the emergency team was waiting at the doors with a gurney. He laid Emma down, they ran. Sophia ran after them, screaming her daughter's name down the corridor. Alessandro stopped at the doors and couldn't go further. For the first time in 3 years he recognized the feeling. A white corridor, plastic chairs, waiting for word about someone you love. 3 years ago he'd stood just like this while people in white coats worked behind other doors on Isabella and Chiara. Neither of them had come out. He couldn't lose Emma, not this child, not after everything. Minutes later Sophia came out and fell against him, not from affection but because her legs had given out. Alessandro held her upright and they waited. At 24 minutes past 1 the lead surgeon came into the corridor, his face tired but not dark. "She's out of danger. We administered epinephrine within 90 seconds and stabilized her airway. 48 hours of observation, but she'll be fine." Sophia sank onto a chair and sobbed into her hands. Alessandro lowered his face into his hands, and for the first time in 20 years, someone was beside him and saw him cry. 2 floors above, in that same hospital that night, Vincenzo came out of surgery alive. He had 2 weeks of intensive care ahead. He'd live long enough to testify against Luca. Luca was transferred to a prison ward under 24-hour guard, awaiting trial. 4 weeks later, in the last days of autumn, honey-gold light fell through the tall upper windows of the Moretti estate and lay in warm rectangles across the floors. Sophia Carter's charges were fully dropped. Bruno and the security team formally apologized in the Great Hall. Alessandro signed a settlement that could have changed a life, But Sophia refused most of it. She took only what would secure Emma's future, not a dollar more. Luca Moretti stood trial, sentenced to life without parole. His son Nathan was taken to Chicago to an aunt on his mother's side, to be raised far from that name. Vincenzo Bellini recovered after 6 weeks. He testified against Luca from a wheelchair, his voice steady for the first time in months. Alessandro retired him with full pension and protection for his family. Vincenzo moved to Vermont to live with his sister. Before he left, he came to Sophia. No apology would ever be enough. Sophia only took his hand and said, "You saved my daughter in that warehouse. That's what I'll remember." Alessandro didn't ask Sophia to stay as his maid. He asked her and Emma to move into the estate as family. She hesitated for weeks. In the end, she agreed, not for the money, but because she'd seen something change in his eyes, and she didn't want to watch it fade again. Emma now has her own room in the East Wing, next to the Rose Garden. She attends a small international school in Manhattan. She has her own allergist, 4 spare EpiPens always in the house, in her room, in the car, in Sophia's bag, in Alessandro's desk drawer. The estate, that beautiful tomb for 3 years, began to breathe. Emma's laughter ran through the marble corridors. Every morning Sophia put fresh flowers in the living room. Alessandro ate dinner with them every evening at the long table, something he hadn't done with anyone since Isabella was alive. On his desk under a warm lamp sits a small glass case. Inside lies one used EpiPen, the blue cap, the empty barrel. He will keep it there until the end of his days, because that little girl didn't just give him the last dose of medicine, she gave him the one thing all his money and power could never buy back: a second chance to love. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't come with thunder, they come quietly in the smallest hands, and they don't let go. Dear friends, if this story touched something inside you tonight, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're listening from, and which moment moved you the most. Maybe there's a small person in your life who changed everything. We truly want to hear what rises from the depth of your heart. Every comment becomes part of the community we're building together. Please share this video with someone who needs this story right now, and subscribe to receive stories that touch the soul every day. From all of us, we wish you health, peace of mind, and a life filled with quiet joy. Thank you for staying until the end. Take care of yourselves and those beside you. But this is only the beginning. What happens next will change everything. Secrets will be revealed, lives will be shattered, and love will be tested in ways you never expected. If you want to see part 2, here's what you need to do. Like this video, it shows us you want more. Subscribe and hit the bell so part 2 appears immediately, and comment part 2 so we know you're ready. Every like, every comment, every subscription tells us, keep going, keep telling these stories.